It's an honor to speak in front of such a wonderful audience. I've been trying to listen into some of the talks, but it's hard since I'm not only not a programmer, but I'm not even an ICT person, so please pardon my potential failures. But on the other hand, I'll bring you some updates and some news from the AI front, because as you might have heard, the battle over the AI regulations is in full swing, and we're just a week before the potentially crucial for the future of regulations of artificial intelligence, the plenary vote at the European Parliament. I've been working on the AI Act for over a year now and half a year at Panopticon Foundation, and it's been a fun but wild ride, and hopefully I'm gonna show you some snippets from the one of the fiercest battles within the whole campaign. So, I'm representing Panopticon Foundation. We're a watchdog and a think tank that deals with digital rights. Founded in 2009, we focused on multiple of issues. Firstly, privacy. Then we broadened our scope to tackle other potential legal problems with mainly big tech. And that's one of the outcomes of my presentation, is the fact that big tech is present not only in the discussions over platform regulations or e-commerce, but also the AI. So, why is it such a big deal? Why have I been invited to such a great conference to speak about large language models? A year ago, it wasn't a thing. I mean, from the technical, legal point of view, there weren't any laws. There were some standards and some discussions over how to regulate certain technologies, but it wasn't a big thing. Obviously, something has changed. So when ChatGPT was launched in October in its third iteration, the third generation of ChatGPT, of course, I know the picture it's basically it's fake news because it doesn't come from GPT, it comes from Midjourney, but still, I hope you get the gist. So when the GPT app was launched in October and November 2022. I know it's hard for you to believe, but for a lot of people it was the first time that artificial intelligence seemed as something tangible. Before that, people were discussing AI, but in a lot of cases it was restricted to questions of science fiction or very technical minor advancements when it comes to machine learning, computer vision, and so on. But it hasn't been a year, and there are numbers for that. So, for instance, you might have heard that GPT became the fastest growing app in the history of internet, which is already something quite astounding. And, well, the things that happened next hopefully will lead to some productive results. But as I mentioned before, it is a fun ride. So, the first thing that happened was moral panic, and people that started using GPT, particularly journalists, were spreading a lot of news, and the hype was being shared all over the internet. And I assume that with a lot of the claims, many of you don't agree. We at Panopticon as well, but there are some positives to this situation. First of all, AI regulations became something that you can actually talk to politicians and regulators. Before that, they were trying to avoid you at any cost, and the side effect of that is that only lobbyists and professional interest groups have access to politicians because, well, unlike them, we don't have cookies, so we have to appeal to some other sentiments. And thanks to the hype over AI, even if it's in many cases overblown, it at first brought some positive result. Well, another interesting result was the sudden at first I would say a collapse, but maybe a suspension of the big tech alliance. So in a lot of, as we call them in Brussels, in a lot of files, there are camps, and big tech is very often acting together, whereas the civil society and certain social organizations are usually on the other side. Of course, it's not the same in every single case, but it's easier to get around to thinking about it. Another thing that changed is the fact that, well, I used to hear a lot that, you know, artificial intelligence doesn't need any regulations. We have to let innovators do their thing, and then the market's gonna regulate itself. And it's been a mantra. It's been repeated multiple times by representatives of larger and smaller organizations. Well, it's not something it's okay to say, at least in a lot of places with public audience anymore. So at this point, we're in a different place over the whole regulatory discussion surrounding the AI. But not everything has changed. First of all, well, in the larger scheme of things, there haven't been large changes when it comes to the international context. So despite, for instance, some Altman claiming that we need a global agency that's gonna be similar to the nuclear energy agency regulating the use of this technology, there aren't any enforceable and legally binding treaties or norms that could be used to tackle the subject. The second thing I wanted to mention is the myth that there's no such a thing as AI regulations. Well, there are many regulations that people who are developing certain technologies, particularly for commercial use, have to follow, and as probably majority of you know about many of them, but there isn't one coherent, holistic piece of legislation that could be used as something that would coordinate the whole sector. This is probably going to change in a while, quite soon, but it's still true. Another thing is that we have to watch out, and even after the whole hype, despite certain claims that many large companies have started using the language of ethical, responsible AI and the need for regulation for the good of humanity, at the same time, there are also things that happen under the surface, and a lot of advocacy campaigns and lobbying efforts have been going on or even accelerating despite the sudden change of mood among the general public. Well, yes, and the last thing that I wanted to mention for starters is the fact that as it was the case 2 years ago, we still have one piece of legislation that might have actually a big impact on the future of AI as technology, of course from the regulatory point of view, and it's the AI Act. Okay, despite certain bombastic and pompous claims about the threats that AI supposedly poses to humanity, or that we're in a place where the new sentient being is gonna be created or invented, there are some very particular and very precise problems that the publication of apps and models such as GPT caused. And here are the excerpts from the OECD, very recent OECD report, supplemented by our findings as related to large language models such as GPT. And the main point that have been raised both by the technologists and the lawyers that deal with digital rights are as follows. So it's discrimination, exclusion, and toxicity, and it's related to the regulation of speech, hate speech, and free speech. I know it's a touchy subject, and there are different ways of approaching it, but here in Europe, an important piece of legislation is right now coming into force, and it's the Digital Service Act. And it's something that people who particularly deploy technologies such as GPT will have to take into consideration if it, of course, applies to that certain system or system application. Well, but from Panopticon's and from my personal point of view, even more pressing issue is related to privacy. There are several questions related to the techniques that were employed once the GPT model has been trained. I mean, at the first level, there are allegedly, of course, it's nothing is certain at this point, and we don't have access to the information. But there are serious accusations that personal data of, for instance, minors under 13 years old have been used, basically scrapped from the internet, and you cannot do that to Europeans at least without the direct consent of parents. So like you don't have to actually look for more arguments to show that it's been probably created in a non-ethical and non-legal way. But there are other problems related to privacy. For instance, you might have heard that certain prompts that have been put into systems such as GPT have for some reason been leaked either to the competition or to the OpenAI or Microsoft itself. I'm not an entrepreneur, but if I were one, I wouldn't like to use a technology that basically sends all the vital information back to my direct competition. This is not something I'd like to do. But there are also several other issues that could be raised. And you might have heard, for instance, about the threat of disinformation. Luckily for now, we haven't seen large-scale disinformation campaigns employed by the politicians. So that's a good thing, I guess. But on the other hand, you might have also read about the overflooding of Amazon reviews based on GPT and similar chatbots. And these are regular people or regular companies using these technologies. And it might be even legal at this point, but it also completely removes the even basic levels of trust from the internet as we know it. So it's definitely a challenge we have to face. Another thing that you might have also heard mainly from the media, and it's kind of relates to the moral panic problem or phenomenon that I mentioned, is the potential use of technologies such as GPT or basically multi-model large language models to impersonate people, to commit fraud. I don't know if you trust, if you even answer once an unknown number is calling you, but imagine hearing the voice of someone close to you, and that might be a problem, especially for people who don't have very high critical digital literacy skills. And of course, threats to intellectual property. We also don't know what kind of databases, consisted of, and what types of art was used. Of course, this is something that can be changed, but as I learned, and you probably know, it's very hard and very expensive to retrain. Basically, it's impossible to retrain a large language model. If you want to do it again, it costs gigantic amount of money and even more importantly, resources, computational power, energy, and then there are other layers to that process. But its law is not that the problems with law are far from done. We cannot just talk about the law because there are other perhaps more far-fetched problems that have been raised as potential concerns. First of all, everybody's afraid of automation, and again, one of the first things you hear when you listen to a podcast or a conversation about AI is the question, when and if will it take our jobs? At judging from the history of technological progress, it's not a real threat. But in the shorter term, obviously, we have seen a lot of people displaced from their jobs and a lot of even white-collar jobs that have been considered to be safe. That, for instance, were people who were taught to do those jobs were considered to be creative, and those places, those jobs were considered to be safe. Well, not necessarily anymore. There is this running joke that when we thought about the future, we wouldn't consider that poets and painters would be replaced first, and programmers and even manual laborers would come later on, if at all. And of course, there is also misinformation, mental health. It's a very interesting subject. Even today, I participated in a discussion with representatives of people with disabilities who've been trying and are still trying to push for certain amendments to AI Act that would higher the level, that would make the level of protection of people with disabilities higher, even for programs who are not considered particularly risky or high risk. For people, particularly again with mental health issues, it might be a problem. I know some people who speak to GPT daily. It came to me as shock, but such people do exist, and I'm talking about having in-depth emotional conversations about personal life events. So just imagine someone with certain vulnerabilities doing the same. Well, it's very easy to imagine potential negative outcomes, and it's not necessarily a problem that could be tackled just by regulations. So I'm not an utopian. Not everything can be banned or restricted, but for instance, even in questions when it comes to building certain critical skills, well, it needs investment, it needs time, and this is something that we have to do. And at this stage at this pace of technology, is very hard to achieve. So I've just mentioned a brief list of certain very real, very precise, and very practical problems. So why do people such as Sam Altman speak about this gigantic civilizational, I would say, extinction level threats? Well, first of all, it's easier than speaking about very precise regulations. Second of all, I look at it not as a lawyer. I'm looking at it not as a lawyer, but more of an cultural anthropologist. It's easier to sway people and to persuade them to your way of reasoning, or perhaps to convince them that your interests are for the good, if you so-called widen the overtones window. So if we're discussing issues such as the extinction of human race, the collapse of human civilization, or the end of planet, well, does a teenager that commits suicide look like a serious problem? No, but if you want to tackle things one by one, then it's completely different. And this is of course my interpretation. It's better for people who are leading certain industries or heading super innovative companies to talk about these large problems, because we all agree that we cannot solve them now. Well, there are some problems we can solve, but that's the second point. They don't necessarily want to do that, and I will be getting more into the nitty-gritty of AI Act negotiations in a moment. But this is something I would like you to think about after this speech is over. Well, and here we come to the technical legal details. What is a large language model? This is a question I'm definitely not qualified to give you answer to, but what I can do is to guide you through the ideas that were floating around the negotiating tables regarding the AI Act in Brussels. So first of all, the original draft of the AI Act the foundational piece of legislation for the future of AI regulations in Europe, didn't mention anything about either large language models or general purpose AI or anything other than AI systems. So as we learned, and we learned it only in February after a report by Corporate Europe Observatory was published, it was already a result of lobbying on behalf of large companies to not touch this issue. So something was already cooking, but it wasn't market ready, and it didn't find way to the first version. Then, a year later, in October and November 2022, the European Commission, so basically the heads of states in Europe, proposed their own version, because if you thought that a law in Europe or in the European Parliament is being passed by the Parliament, no. It's way more complicated. There are three parties, so it's the governments, it's the European Parliament, and it's the European Commission. So the Commission didn't mention anything about general purpose AI or large language models. Then the Council introduced the term general purpose AI, and I spent at least 8 weeks trying to talk to my to my friends who are scientists dealing with the AI, because before Panoptykon I worked at an AI research institute, Ideas and CBR, in Warsaw. And they couldn't provide me with an answer, what is general purpose AI? Of course, they could tell me what general AI is, but what is this general purpose? So this is one of the inventions that lawmakers in Brussels are capable of, is to come up with certain terms that well, mean something in the legal way, but not necessarily translate directly to the language of technology and science. So a term general purpose AI was introduced. It was regulated very closely to so-called high risk AI systems, which is the second level of category according to the AI Act. So you've got prohibited uses of AI. There are high risk systems that pose certain risks, but given certain standards and procedures, could be utilized in a fruitful and beneficial way. Well, so general purpose AI, so programs such as models and programs such as GPT, or models as GPT and programs such as ChatGPT could be used just like other risky technologies, but it would require providers to meet certain standards and criteria. Well, yes, from that point, again, a lot has changed. So it was late March this year when one of the several batches, one of several pieces of drafts with certain amendments put on them circulated around the negotiating table, and one of the new things that popped up was the fact that I mean, programs such as GPT would not be considered general purpose anymore. Now they would be called foundation models. So it's a completely new term that found its way to the latest stages of the legislation, and it was very interesting because the window for potential changes was very short. It was late March. By the late April, it was supposed to be all agreed upon, and basically the articles that were devoted to foundation models were very specific, basically market ready, and no one really cared about them apart from companies that have direct interest. So I tried to speak to my both private sector and public sector friends who are AI researchers. They wouldn't be able to tell me a lot about foundation models as such. They didn't, of course, they didn't know anything about this new versions of certain articles, and basically it led to a situation. And since watchdogs and think tanks and other civil society organizations were focused on different things. We were focused on providing very tangible mechanisms that citizens could use, for instance, right to redress, right to explanation, ability to lodge a complaint against an unfair AI decision, and so on and so forth. No one really focused on that, so the articles came in and they were accepted. And in 7 days, there will be vote upon them. And what's in them? Well, this is quite interesting because if you didn't know what a foundation model is, well, there's the definition. Foundation models is an AI model that is trained on broad data at scale, is designed for generality of output, and can be adapted to a wide range of distinctive tasks. If it isn't a super vague definition, that I haven't seen one, but apparently this is probably gonna be the cornerstone of the future of legal standing of programs such as GPT, Bard, or even Midjourney. What's weird, and I'm not certain if it will stand, is the fact that general purpose AI systems as a definition remained. To me, it seems that it's logically it's a wider category than foundation models, but there aren't any articles devoted to general purpose AI systems. So it's kind of a relic. We'll see if someone notices it, but at this point, it doesn't make much sense. And there's also the third term I use in the title of my presentation, which is generative AI. And when we were thinking about how to tackle it from the legal point of view, the term generative AI made most sense. First of all, it doesn't touch the question of technology, which is always better from the legal point of view. It tackles certain functions. It's not so much that you want to regulate a technology. You want to either ban or restrict certain uses of the technology. You don't need to properly define what a car is in order to put a ban over a certain limit of speed. So generative AI would make sense. Unfortunately, this term didn't make into the regulation. There are some articles that touch upon it. It's very limited. And it's basically, if you're planning to launch a generative AI service, there are very few obligations that you have to follow if it's not a large language model trained on a data at scale. And the thing you have to do is to basically make sure that the people who use such systems have a notification, a visible information, that the content that is generated is not made by humans. So I don't think it's a very high bar, but there it is. And of course, if a large language model is being used as a chatbot, there will also be this obligation to inform users about the fact that they're not speaking to a real human, which, at least from what I've seen at the market, it's a standard, and that's a good thing. Okay, but when I mentioned the whole sway of articles that would cover the foundation models that no one really commented on, it was very short period of time that allowed for a discussion. It's basically mainly Article 28b, which enlists the obligations of providers. What is a provider? So basically the definition, the main difference in the AI Act from the point of view of certain actors in the AI sector. So the main difference is between the providers, who can be either developers or importers, and the deployers. So if you're buying access, or if you're offering access to a service based on a large language model that you haven't created, you're just using it, you're a deployer. And you've got a different set of obligations than if you're the provider or importer. And at the earlier stages of the negotiations, it was the providers that would have to follow certain rules. So it would have to be Microsoft or OpenAI or Alphabet, Google or Facebook that would have to meet certain criteria. After the changes, it's going to be the deployer. So a public institution, a private company, a small startup or an individual that will have to meet certain standards, particularly if it's if LLM is going to be used in the so-called high-risk AI use cases for AI for high-risk AI systems. And there are very specific requirements. So first of all, the provider of an foundational model will have to demonstrate the reasonably foreseeable risks to health, safety, and fundamental rights, environment, and democracy. Sounds pretty vague again and quite wishy-washy, but certain companies, particularly larger companies, will already have established certain compliance and ethical standards, so they're already way ahead when compared to their startup or SMEs competitors. Second of all, the focus is going to be put on data. Not only data sets will have to be, will have to be designed and organized in a way that that doesn't violate the law at any stage, but it will also have to be properly managed, not just before the product or the model hitting the market, but also afterwards. And what's also quite interesting is that the technical documentation will have to be kept 10 years after the product leaves the market. So it's basically, if you wanna establish a company that does foundational models, you will have to keep those records for 10 years after you close your business. Then there are another thing that's, I think might be quite impactful is the fact that the last stages of the AI Act negotiations put a lot of focus on energy and sustainability. We don't know yet what precise standards will be, but the energy use is going to be something that's going to be monitored. You will have to comply with certain standards, and you will have to be subject to evaluation by certain institutions. So it's a new thing. It wasn't the question of green and sustainable AI, as I have been following it, is quite. It's quite new as a question of discussions. I know that there are already some standards being implemented, but even the big players are not very keen on showing how much energy has been used in the case of particular system. Certain companies are better at that, but OpenAI, we don't know. There's just guesses on how much energy did it actually use. Yes, and apart from that, there will be also transparency obligations, and again, a very broad provision requiring the providers of such models adequate safeguards against generation of content in breach of EU law. Well, EU law is everything that's being passed by the EU. It's probably it's going to apply also to the national law, so companies such as Microsoft, Google, Facebook, or other potential competitors will have to beef up their legal departments, perhaps even more than deployers of certain systems. There are some general provisions, but they're not enforceable, but it's also good to keep in mind. And then, as I mentioned before, apart from providers, there are deployers, which will have to follow certain requirements, mainly if they're going to apply large language models in the context of high-risk systems. So systems that function, for instance, in the crime prevention or border management or education or at the level of office or the labor market and so on and so forth. if so, then the particular requirements will be put on them, but only in the aspect of actually doing the high risk, preparing a high risk service or a product. Yes. Another thing that changed, it was again it was introduced in a silent way. It was the lowest possible threshold for a penalty, and you can guess it's going to apply. The lowest threshold of penalties are going to be applicable only to the foundation models. So in a way, it's cheaper. The risk is lower, at least the financial risk, if you're doing a foundation model than if you're putting a high risk AI system into the market, which is again quite interesting. Because one could assume that those large companies like Microsoft or Alphabet or Meta are actually the ones that could pay, unlike certain small companies or innovators. But that's not what found its way into the regulation. And yes, so we're at a stage where there hasn't been much discussion. When I was preparing this presentation, I know there's a lot of stuff, but I think it's important, and there aren't many sources. When I was trying to find some information on how to be compliant with the new EU regulations on artificial intelligence, well, not much focus is put on that, so that might be something worthwhile. And yes, but the AI Act is far from the most pressing topic when it comes to AI and law. And again, going back to Sam Altman, you might have heard that during his tour, and he visited Warsaw among other places quite recently. During his tour, he raised the possibility of establishing a new global agency devoted to questions of regulation, the AI regulations under the auspices of United Nations. I don't think it's a coincidence. As you know, there's a war at the eastern border of Poland in Ukraine, and one of the global institutions that was supposed to act in such situation is the United Nations. Well, it hasn't done its job, and I'm afraid that suggesting that we need United Nations to tackle the AI regulations would achieve the same results, which is not much, and that's precisely why people such as Altman are mentioning the United Nations as an entity that could deal with that, and not the European Union, who, with all its weaknesses and with all the potential criticisms that one might have against the European Union, at least first of all, it exists. It passes new laws, and those laws are enforceable. And this is something that we should have in mind. But there are other ideas, and they're happening simultaneously. So the AI Act is gonna be finished probably by the end of the year, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the Parliament is probably gonna pass it in a week. And then this mysterious process of trilogue takes place, where the Commission, the chiefs of governments, and the European Parliament negotiate the final wording of the bill, and we as citizens don't have much say anymore on the final outcome of those negotiations. But apart from that, there are at least 2 or 3 simultaneous processes that aim at establishing new types of regulations. So there's this idea of global AI pact, which would be free to join declaration of willingness to follow certain rules, but it would be companies would be able to take part in that. So it's not dedicated to the nation states, but to individual companies. Of course, OECD, so an international organization, and Council of Europe is also working on their own regulations, but we shouldn't put much interest in that due to the fact that they pass a lot of regulations and well, not much happens afterwards due to the lack of enforcement. Well, as I mentioned, as I already said, the idea of United Nations AI agency is not something we should be looking forward to. So, despite its continental scope of, despite the scope of the regulation and the size of the European single market, which is basically restricted to Europe, the best chance we have at coming up with a potentially global AI regulation is the AI Act. That's why it's quite important. And even though it's not a perfect piece of legislation, and there are a lot of things that could be made better. And as Panoptykon, we're still fighting for instance, for certain amendments that would broaden the right to explanation or would allow civil society organizations to help people who are affected by the decisions of AI systems. We want that to come into the final text of the AI Act. But again, there isn't much, we don't have much alternative. It's either AI Act or we'll have to keep our fingers crossed that that largest companies and big governments won't be utilizing AI against us. And it's a real threat because there are many examples of less advanced but systems still based on machine learning being used. For instance, there was a quite scandalous case in the Netherlands when the government secretly was using very simple but still AI systems to look for rank people according to their behavior, and on that basis would distribute certain welfare funds. So this is something that might happen to all of us given the creativity of our current rulers, or should I say the current government. And yes, and so what are the main takeaways? First of all, it's really important what we talk about and how we talk about things. And to our surprise, the gigantic hype over AI actually has led to certain positive outcomes. So whenever you're frustrated when you hear your aunt or uncle talking about, you know, AI coming for their pension or their jobs, there might be something good. It might lead to a good result, even though it's technically, of course, false. But this window of opportunity was quite brief because after 2 or 3 months, once people got perhaps bored, or perhaps certain people found another subject to be interested in, the lobbying efforts returned to the status quo, and certain provisions such as the foundation models were introduced. And I'm not saying it's specifically a bad piece of regulation, but there weren't discussion about it. We weren't discussing about it, the scientists weren't talking about it, the innovators weren't talking about it, so we basically have to trust that legal departments of very few companies have done the job for us, and we can take it, or we can, you know, reevaluate our professional choices and perhaps change a job if you're very deeply involved with the field of AI. Second of all, there are still some questions, and I've heard them raised by particularly small and medium-sized entrepreneurs who are working on, for instance, the previous generations of LLMs and GPT-2 or 3 that were given wider access to those models, and right now it's not really certain what type of provisions will be offered to them. Perhaps now it's okay, but what if it changes? There are some provisions in the AI Act that want to tackle unfair business conditions imposed on small companies by large providers, but it's still yet to be decided by the European Commission what that exactly means. And as I assume all of you are consumers, we also have this regulation that's supposed to protect consumers, but I don't know what was the last time you negotiated, for instance, a deal when you were at a bank and trying to get a new service. What was the scope of negotiable position that you could actually alter the deal? Well, it's either you take it or you leave it. So there's a threat that is going to be the same. Well, and yes, the last thing that I wanted to mention is less related to the large language models and foundation models as such, but more to the general narrative and the discussion on AI Act and the AI regulations as such. For instance, I very often hear an argument that, you know, regulating the AI will stifle innovation. This is a mantra being repeated over and over again. And it's particularly striking to me when I hear it from researchers. Like it's the very first page of the legislation. It states very clearly, AI Act won't have any effect on research and the military. So whenever you hear someone talking that, you know, it's gonna stop scientists from inventing new things, no. Or it's gonna make us more prone to attacks from foreign powers or foreign adversaries, again, no. The other argument that I'd like to address is the fact that certain provisions, and some of those provisions our goals have been the focus of our work as Panopticon, or the European Digital Rights Network that we are part of, or a member of, is the fact that certain regulations related to protection of fundamental rights, such as privacy, dignity, we're talking, you know, today is only yesterday I watched a video of the new Vision Pro, I guess, product by Apple, which apart from giving us wonderful functions, Tim Cook, I think he even directly mentioned it. Well, it has a lot of access to our thoughts. So the question of privacy is not a question related to the information we share. It's getting more and more personal, to the level of one of the researchers calls this question mental cognitive liberty. So we're getting to a point where even the insights of our head might be potentially monetized to provide us with more personalized ads, because I assume that's the main goal of innovation in certain sectors of the market. And well, so in order not to stifle innovations, we should simply remove as much regulation as possible. Well, and a lot of people don't agree with that. Well, but the problem is there. There are certain entities, there are innovators who will have harder time meeting certain criteria and certain standards. But in my opinion, or in our opinion, it should be tackled differently. It should be tackled on the financial level. It should be, certain programs should be employed potentially by the state, maybe by the private sector, that would make it possible to apply and be provided with funds specifically for following certain compliance obligations, for instance. Because it's even one of the main things we fought for was the fundamental rights impact assessment, which is a procedure that the developers or the deployers of high-risk AI system will have to follow. Well, it's not very complicated. In my opinion, a team of a lawyer and an engineer would do it over a weekend tops, provided they have the sufficient amount of information. But of course, it also it can also translate to certain costs. Well, let's fight for specific funds that people could apply to, so they would not have to worry about it. I'm just trying to show a piece of logic, and it's, as you might assume, it's been quite frustrating talking about certain topics, hearing the same arguments repeated over and over again. The least favorite one is the one about stifling efforts of researchers and scientists, because it's simply not true. Okay, thank you. I think it's a good time to hear from you. I would love to answer certain questions if you have some, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay. Questions, okay.
Right. First of all, thank you for shedding some light on the AI Act. I think you've covered the most important points, definitely. I was kind of confused, maybe a bit disappointed to see some of the focus on the direct impacts, which you've argued for that are really important here to look at.
So I didn't hear the end of your sentence.
Is this better? So the direct impacts, obviously by their definition, directly impact us. But trying to put laws on them is going to be made instantly obsolete by advancements in the core technology. The making or doing bad or doing harm with the models is not the primary concern I share, especially when you consider how much easier these models make it to make software, to make other models to do things like this. The core metric here, and this is something that has long seemed sci-fi, is intelligence. The core metric is how much can this do for the person. And then the abstraction of foundational models does make sense, because you have a foundational model which harnesses most of the core intelligence, and you have the providers which can apply it to specific problems.
Deployers, yeah.
Right, and apply it to specific problems. And those specific problems, obviously, there is a ton of regulation that should go into that, as it's a large new capability. But that doesn't take away from, yeah, exactly, that slide, the power and potential danger of the foundational systems, and how the laws should follow like the capability and not the direct effect of those models.
Well, this is one of the main changes that took place over the whole general purpose and foundation models debate. So it's still far from over, because, as I mentioned in the trialogue, it's the Commission that's going to negotiate with the governments, and it's the governments that had the general purpose regulatory ecosystem in certain provisions that would be closer to what, if I get your argument correctly, that you would argue for, which is it's the people who provide you with certain technology that should be responsible more, and that was the earlier stage. But after the, yet again, campaign on behalf of large companies in Brussels, that's the only way I could explain it, the responsibilities and obligations remained to a certain level at the deployer. So if an institution or a company uses such an LLM, there will still be certain obligations, particularly if it is used in this high-risk context, but there will be less obligations and less responsibility for on provider's end. And this is something that's very hard to argue at this point because we haven't seen the whole AI large language model ecosystem emerge. So we don't know how it's going to be. Perhaps there's going to be thousands of companies that are competing, and it's going to be so cheap to train a model, and energy is going to be even cheaper than 10 or 20 years ago. But if not, yes, it might lead to a situation where a small group of very potent companies will have a control over this myriad of smaller startups and smaller companies who, apart from very bare protections, as I mentioned about the unfair conditions imposed on smaller companies, but as far as I remember, this article only is applicable in a situation when the deployer uses it in a high-risk context. So if it's not, and it's going to be 99% of all AI systems, well, there won't be any protection. So if a large provider of a large language model, assuming it's non-European, it's either US-based or based in some other country outside of the EU, has the control over a whole range of a swarm of small and medium-sized companies who are completely dependent on them. Yes? So it might be the ecosystem that's emerging at this point. And again, at Panoptykon, we deal with fundamental rights, we deal with privacy, we deal with mental health when it comes, of course, to certain aspects of new technologies. We don't deal with inequality, economic issues related to, like we have no say whether we prefer socialism or free market capitalism. It's not our area of expertise. But such discussion didn't take place anywhere. And the only voices that were being raised were the voices of, well, people who spoke directly to members of the European Parliament who proposed very specific pieces of regulation. So this is something I think we should be worried because it's too much of an important issue for us to simply accept without any further discussions. But I think it's a very, very valid question.
Yeah, just a very quick comment. I think it's definitely valuable to surround yourself with those people that indeed went to the European Union, people at OpenAI that are focusing on this. You of course also have others like Anthropic, DeepMind. These people are definitely willing to engage, speaking from first experience, with those arguments and want to be open about these, because you highlighted Sam Altman's arguments, and DeepMind's Demis Hassabis shares these too. So they very much believe it's in their own benefits and the benefit of the world to be open about this and to engage in these arguments.
Well, there very well might be. Also, we haven't seen this system in action, the postulated system. They might have better ideas than other people, but it's only up to them. And I think that's the not okay part, because if they change their mind or they're being bought by somebody else, well, it's free for all. Then yes.
Okay, so I'd like to ask about a specific issue, which I think is the most pressing one. You mentioned the mental health issues, and it has fired my imagination, because it's very easy to imagine a lonely, tormented person, which lets ChatGPT assume a role of their personal therapist, which is always accessible 24/7, free. You don't even need to get out of bed to talk to it. And while this model it has never been trained for this, there was no licensing, no testing, no regulations, no procedure, nothing whatsoever. And this is like horrifying. So my question is, does anybody has any idea what to do about it?
Yes, I'm very happy to answer this question. My CEO at Panoptykon, for instance, Kasia Szmilewicz, and Dorota Głowacka, another lawyer from Panoptykon, they have a project called Healthy Newsfeed. It started off as a project related to Digital Service Act, which I mentioned before, which is basically its main topic is the recommended systems. It's the recommender systems within large platforms, but that touches a lot of different areas as well, and it is related to mental health issues. When it comes to chatbots, I think the perils are really big. At the same time, I have seen and I've been told about potential positive uses of chatbots, particularly with people with very specific mental disorders and people who are psychotic, or it's being used in a therapeutical sense. But this is something completely different. We're not talking about a treatment that's been approved by the doctor and supervised by the therapist with a very specific program. We're talking about a potentially so-called bull generator, as Jan LeCun called it, that can wreak havoc among people who are most vulnerable. And again, it's not about moral panic. Probably people who are gonna do terrible things such as commit suicide or acts of self-harm. We don't see that, we don't see the wave of such tragedies, but at the same time, even if the negative impact is low, but it's extended over time, and for instance, if children are if they internalize such type of relations as something normal, well, this is definitely a huge topic that we should be discussing, and perhaps there are other ways to target it. Maybe schools should do their thing. Perhaps there should be general investment into the critical digital skills among the population, but at the same time, if a program negatively affects an individual or mentally distorts his or her decision-making process, well, it should be the deployer or the provider of such a model, in my opinion, and I hopefully, if I understand the AI Act right, and if it stays in the current form up until it's implemented, well, it will be possible. That's one of the things that we're looking forward to, is certain rights for people affected by AI systems have been granted in the latest, newest version of the AI Act. We don't know how the system will work. At this point, we're doing our best and keeping our fingers crossed so that MEPs vote the way they voted in a couple of weeks ago on the committee level at the European Parliament. And we also hope that, because that's another big threat, because the governments have a bit different agenda than the deputies at the European Parliament. And it's not just the Polish government, for instance, that doesn't want AI Act to be applicable to anything related to national security. Yes, of course, Polish government doesn't want that. We asked this question to a representative of the ruling party. I think it was a week ago, and he confirmed our supposition. But it's also the government of France that would like its intelligence services, but also the police, in the case of broadly defined national security. And as we know, anything can be a matter of national security if you really want it to be so. Then this is something we should be fighting for. And there are some initiatives to do that, but it's very often is a tug of war. So the big corporations want to pay, you know, lower taxes and low fines, and the governments want to avoid any type of supervision, and we are somewhere in the middle, couple of dozens of people trying to scrap, you know, these little patches of liberties and freedom in the middle, and sometimes it bears result. I'm really, sometimes I'm very positively surprised because there are battles you can win, but yes, this is a huge subject. Another thing, perhaps even more important than AI regulations, in the case of mental health, is privacy. Like, if your therapist or my therapist uses the AI either as a supplement to the therapy, because it can do potentially wonderful things in terms of diagnostics, well, who owns the data? Who can replicate it? It's not just, it's no longer just notes on paper that someone can steal, perhaps, but who would do that? It's something that feeds potentially the model and makes the system better, makes the model better. At the same time, it can be used and used against you. So there are very big questions related to health and mental health. And by the way, there is a big European regulation that will force basically all doctors to provide information. Luckily, it's going to be anonymous or pseudo-anonymous, but it's also happening. So our data will feed the machine in one way or another. Yes.
Okay, last question.
I just wanted to ask if you can clarify about the location. I understand the law applies to maybe providers or deployers. So for me as an end user, I can still use a service from a deployer that's outside of European Union. So like for, if I'm not a company that has to follow some law, I'm just looking for a, I know, psychiatrist online, I can do that. That law doesn't matter, right?
I mean, it's a bit complicated. I should have mentioned, and I want to address the first part of your question. If you're an entrepreneur or an individual and you're using things for fun, for educational purposes, it's all okay. If you're doing it for research, you can use super dangerous AI if it's not hitting the market and you don't affect other people, but it's mainly the market part. So the whole thing related to AI Act is related to the scope of the regulation, and it's applicable only when a system or a model is available on the market. It doesn't have to be a private market. If it was just a private market, then the Ministry of Justice would be off the hook. So market is here defined as broader, so it also includes public services, public institutions, and so on. When it comes to the territory, it applies to, well, it's both very practical and philosophical question. The only reason why anybody cares about what the European Union has to say about AI is it's not because we have the best AI companies or the largest AI companies on the market. It's because we have one of the best markets. So if you want to sell something here, you have to follow our rules. So it's also related to the question of marketplace. So if you're if you're an individual user, you're free to go. The company that provides you with a service has to follow EU regulations, even if they're not in the EU, because you are representing the market, and that's your force. I don't know if it sounds optimistic, but you're this is something that we could utilize on for our own purposes, and it's a good way to think about stuff. Again, the European Union cannot regulate how police works, but it can regulate what products and services will be available on the market, and we have one European market. So if the police wants to buy something and it's not available or it shouldn't be available on the market, that's the way to approach it. So that's actually quite a smart way to deal with issues that would be considered not covered by the EU treaties. And of course, there's a huge, I don't want to get into that, there's a huge international law debate and European law debate. It's related to federalization, the national sovereignty, and so on. But the EU says the EU says, like, we're regulating the market. We all agree that we need one single European market. It's in the treaties. Let's talk about what you can purchase or rent or even make available for free on the market. And that's the way to shape not only the legal realm, but also in a way how the technology is being developed. Yeah.
Okay, the time is up. Let's give a warm round of artificially generated applause